This is the Denafrips Terminator Plus. This is Denafrips' flagship R2R DAC, and this was not loaned to me for review. This was not given to me for review. This was actually purchased using funds from Patreon, and it's going to be sold after this video is done. In future, I'm going to be using some of the Patreon funds to get stuff in for review, and there's a few reasons for this. Firstly, is it means that I'll be able to get stuff in which I otherwise wouldn't be able to. Some manufacturers just aren't willing to lend things for review, and so it means I can buy those things, review them, and then sell them on afterwards. And even if I eat 20% resale loss, that's fine. That's the cost of doing the video. This is something I enjoy, and if Patreon supporters are able to help me make these videos by covering some of those resale losses, that's absolutely fantastic, and I'm immensely grateful for that. And the second reason is that it's another way to increase transparency and honesty. If I'm not beholden to any companies sending me stuff for review, then I can speak my mind completely honestly. I don't need to worry about whether they're going to send me stuff in future. I've paid for this, and if I want to review the next thing, or if viewers want me to review something else in particular, I can just buy that thing and then sell it on afterwards. It's a much more honest way of doing things, I think. And even from companies who I've not reviewed anything from before, you'd be surprised how many companies stop talking to you and responding to your emails as soon as they realize that you actually do put out negative reviews now and then. There's a lot of companies who will not send you anything unless your catalog is pretty much entirely positive. So I'll be using some of the Patreon funds to cover the cost of getting things in for review. I think this is a more honest way of doing it, and it also means that you guys as supporters can have a greater steer over what things come in for review too. Anyway, let's talk about this DAC. The build quality is a bit mixed. It's good, it feels very, very sturdy, and I do like the aesthetic of this, but the materials could potentially be just a little bit better. I do prefer the finishing of something like a May, and the Bartok makes, well, to be honest, the May and this look a little bit cheap. There's also some issues like you can see quite clearly where the mill has been on the text on top here. It's not just smooth, but things like the buttons, there's no wobble to them, they're very tactile. It's okay. It could be a little bit better, but it's certainly not bad. The user interface could definitely use some tightening up. It's very sleek, but it's certainly not intuitive. For example, phase has a dedicated button, even though you'll probably only ever need to press that once. But if you want to change the oversampling filter, you got to press mute and then input plus, and then I can't remember which one's which. I believe optical is fast, but I'll check later. The point is, unless you have the manual handy, you don't know what you're doing. There's a lot of settings where you have to basically decode what LEDs are going on, when they could just have a button, or this should be a screen, or something that's better than this. This is really quite painful unless you have the manual handy, and that's not good for an interface. I also don't know why there's buttons where you'll literally only need to press them once. You don't need to be changing phase all the time. The one thing that really bugs me about the build quality, though, is the feet. This DAC has metal feet rather than rubber or anything, so if you just put it on a desk, it's going to scratch stuff. It comes with these little cups, which you have to position under the feet, but trying to move a 20-kilogram DAC and get the feet exactly positioned, which there's only 3 of, by the way, so it wobbles super easily, it's a nightmare. Unless you have 2 people, give up, basically. That's why I'm using these isoacoustics pucks, because Jesus Christ, please, manufacturers everywhere, stop using metal feet. Please use something that I can just put it on and then give me the option to change the feet later or something, rather than just having scratchy metal feet by default. Thank you. In terms of feature set then, this DAC has quite a lot going on. You can change the oversampling filter, and it has a NOS mode, which, if you've not seen my Aries 2 review, go and watch that, or just look at the last bit of the measurements post I did for this on my website to see why that's not NOS, it's linear interpolation. This is a NOS impulse response. This is a low-pass filtered NOS response. This is the Terminator Plus's NOS response. It's not NOS, and it's got some problems like it rolls off a lot more than NOS, it introduces distortion that NOS does not. I would recommend not using the NOS mode on this. It's not NOS, it doesn't sound as good, I don't know why it's here. This is the internal of the DAC, and there's a few interesting points which kind of jump out at you. Firstly, it is obviously an R2R DAC, so you can see that there's lots of ladders there, and these go straight to the output ports. There is no buffer stage on this DAC. Denafrips has not built an output stage because, well, primarily, I imagine, for some kind of signal integrity reason. The downside of this, though, is it does have a very high output impedance. It's 1,250 ohms, which is a lot. Normally, that's not going to cause a problem. Normally, if you're using any kind of solid-state preamp or amplifier, that's not going to be a problem. But if you use a passive preamp, like a Gold Point, or much longer cable runs, you might encounter some treble roll-off, so it's worth bearing that in mind. The next thing is that this DAC does have galvanic isolation. It's not done at the inputs like most DACs would, though. It is done, well, here. That's why there's a big gap between the digital input board and the actual DAC itself. This raised board here is the clock, and you can see that there is a lot of filtering and voltage regulation going on. Big oven-controlled clock, which is also a bit of a, well, clever clock, because it can output various rates to the word clock outputs, as well as whatever the DAC itself needs. And also, I'm presuming that this is able to slightly change its rate in order to account for the buffer challenges which are present when you try and buffer a synchronous signal like SPDIF. To say that this DAC has a lot of filtering might be an understatement. There's a lot. Like, a lot. And it's not just a few big caps as well. It's a lot of smaller ones in parallel. The reason they've done that is because you get lower equivalent series resistance when you use more smaller caps in parallel rather than a bigger one just in series. I don't know if that actually makes any difference, but it's nice to see that they've gone the extra mile. This is a really nice internal. It looks like they've done a really, really nice job here. Would have been nice to see an output buffer stage, though. I don't really know why they've not done that. It would have been good to have. The only issue that I've seen so far with the internal of this DAC is this. You might see that there's quite a lot of metal dust there. And that wasn't me. That wasn't me unscrewing anything. That was there when I opened it. It's actually part of a screw into the lid, which I don't know what goes into it. There's nothing that makes sense to screw there. It has a lot of different inputs, including I2S with configurable pinout, USB, which has galvanic isolation. It has 2 oversampling filter modes, and it's also got clock output, so you can sync a DDC or some other component to the clock that is in this DAC. From a feature standpoint, this is an absolutely lovely DAC. From a build quality standpoint, there's a few things that I would certainly change, but let's talk about sound. When you listen to a Terminator Plus, one of the first things you'll realize is that it's got quite a lot of the R2R stereotypes to the sound. And the clearest of these is that it handles complex and difficult spatial presentations with absolute ease. This, for me personally, is actually one of the clearest differences, generally speaking, between a Delta Sigma DAC and an R2R DAC. It's not that R2R DACs stage bigger. In fact, I don't really feel there's a trend there. If you were to compare this to a Chord Dave and M scaler, the Dave and M scaler has a bigger maximum size of soundstage. It's more expansive. But what R2R DACs are really good at is how they position things within that stage. It's not about the size of stage, it's about the quality of the stage that you have. And so, whereas a Delta Sigma DAC, they tend to lean more towards a presentation that I've seen described, and it's quite an apt description, as a wall of sound. Whereas R2R DACs, everything's just put where it should be. If you're wearing headphones, you get this complex 3D scape around you, and speakers, it's all just beautifully laid out in this landscape in front of you. You get a much more convincing spatial presentation, regardless of what the size of stage is. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this. There are some Delta Sigma DACs which do this beautifully, and there are some R2R DACs which are terrible at it. But generally speaking, this is one of the advantages that I find when I'm listening to an R2R DAC. And so when you listen to something like this, which is someone else's dream, the Slender Bodies remix, originally by Absa Facto, you get this wonderfully immersive, complex presentation surrounding you if you're using headphones, or just put out in front of you if you're using speakers. It's really, really quite something, actually. It's not necessarily the best mastered track in the world overall, but the way that this DAC is showing off the 3D positioning of elements is really, really cool. And it's not something which I've heard done the same way on a Delta Sigma DAC, actually. There are some good Delta Sigma DACs in this particular aspect, but R2R DACs just seem to have the upper hand here. I don't want to give the impression that this is a small-sounding DAC, though, far from it. There are some other DACs, like a Chord Dave and M scaler, which will be bigger in terms of the maximum scale that they can present. But this is not a small-sounding DAC, and this is far bigger than a Yggdrasil, for example, although that's not a strong candidate for soundstage. It is bigger than a Qtist, a TT2, an X26 Pro, and definitely bigger than a Bartok as well. It can do an expansive stage really, really nicely. So when you listen to 6s to 9s by Big Wild, this is the Analog Sessions version, this album's fantastic. You get this wonderfully massive sounding soundscape.
Wait with me. Set aside your inhibitions, maybe. Sometimes when it feels right, maybe it's alright. I look into your eyes, and you're holding me tight. You're in love, you sixes tonight. Yeah.
The reverberations just sound like they go out forever, and everything's so crystal clear. It's not airy and diffused big. It's proper, tactile, positioned, complex, and real sounding big, which is nice. Because that was one complaint I had with the David M scaler, was that it was just a little bit ethereal sounding sometimes. It was big, but it had a sort of HD 800 syndrome where things couldn't get all that intimate very convincingly. So it was big, but somewhat lightweight feeling at the same time, somewhat sort of diffused, whereas this does not have that. It's complex, it's tactile, not quite as good as the May, but getting there. There is one slight quirk to the presentation on this DAC, and it actually took me a few days to work out what this was doing, because I got the DAC, I let it warm up, I plugged it in, I was listening to it for a while, and I was comparing it to various different DACs, and everything I compared it to, this DAC was just doing something just a bit different, and I couldn't work out what it was. I couldn't even decide if I liked it or not. It was just different. And then I was actually listening to this very song, and it clicked. As the track gets more complex, things get further away from you. When the track seems more simple, things are closer in. It's not a massive jump. It's not like a vocalist will go from off in the distance to in your head. But once you hear it, you can't unhear it, and it's quite strange. In a good way, it makes things more kind of dynamic and varied and more impressive in some ways. It's like it's exaggerating layering. But then at the same time, things don't quite stay exactly in the same spot when they perhaps should. So when you listen to this track and it's just the vocalist,
I want you to hold me, come and lay with me.
Obviously there's a guitar playing as well, but just single strums. And he's kind of there. He's like a foot or two in front of you. And then you go to a slightly more complex bit over here.
Turn my sixes tonight, frequently fly.
And as soon as those other voices come in, he's a few feet further away. It's interesting. It's not actually a bad thing. I don't think I dislike it. It's not normal, and it's a bit quirky, but it's worth mentioning, because once you hear that, you can't quite unhear it. The next R2R stereotype is kind of a twofold one. A lot of people say that R2R DACs have better timbre, generally, than Delta Sigma DACs. Again, there are exceptions. The Bartok has amazing timbre, for example. But generally, I would agree. I do find that I get a more convincing and realistic presentation of most instruments and vocals on an R2R DAC than I do on a Delta Sigma DAC. But some people will counter that by saying things like, oh, well, that's just because R2R DACs don't measure very well, they're soft and warm, and that just makes people think that they've got good timbre. Well, the Hollow May disproves the measuring poorly point quite decisively, and if you want to show that this is not a soft-sounding DAC, just play the intro of Bad Bad News. Oh, those kick drums are good. I've played drums since I was about 8, so when drums are done correctly, that makes me happy, and this is making me happy. Seriously, it's a proper kick in the chest type feel. This is a very dynamic and impactful sounding DAC. I would say that the overall tonality and sort of tuning of it is actually slightly on the darker side. It does sound like the treble is slightly pushed down, but I don't mind that at all, actually. I don't mind if something is slightly darker, slightly warmer, slightly drier, slightly brighter, as long as you're not actually incurring any problems in terms of quality. It's a subjective tuning difference. There are some DACs which are brighter, and that's fine as long as they aren't harsh and sibilant. And there are some DACs which might be slightly darker, which is okay as long as they're not smoothed over and losing definition. This is not. This is slightly darker, but it's still very incisive, it's very snappy and fast sounding, and it's very impactful as well. It is far from soft. Moving back onto timbre then, let's actually stick with this song, because this shows off male vocals and a few different instruments really quite well.
Some bad news.
The way that I'd best describe the timbre of this DAC is that it's slightly vivid and saturated compared to real life. If you're wanting ultra realism and just to feel like you are there, this might not necessarily be it. But this does give you what I would call a slightly more engaging experience than a more realistic sound. And that's wonderful to listen to on a lot of different gear. I found that this effect paired really nicely with the Abyss 1266, actually, because these are a really dynamic sounding can, but they are just ever so slightly on the dry side. And so it's not that this is warming things up. This isn't a warm sounding DAC. It's not outright coloring the sound from a tonality perspective, But what this does do is just provide a little bit of extra kind of contrast, vividness. I'll put a visual metaphor on the screen. It's not that you're actually altering the image. You're just turning up the saturation, making things appear a little bit more energetic. And that's really, really good fun. I really, really enjoy that effect, and that's going to appeal to a lot of people. I think that both the spatial presentation not remaining static thing and also this cranking up of saturation speaks to the level of DSP which is going on in this DAC. And this isn't just something which is obvious from a sort of subjective standpoint, listening to it, but also from an objective one, because when I was measuring it, which there's full measurements of this up on my website, by the way, there are a lot of situations where the DAC just seemingly got confused. So a linearity test, for example, which is when you put a full-scale 1 kilohertz tone through it, and you slowly step that down in level, and you see when it starts deviating. It started deviating almost immediately and seemingly randomly because the signal confused it. It's not that the linearity of this DAC is actually bad, and the same exact thing happened to John Atkinson at Stereophile, but the DSP in this DAC didn't know how to handle it, and so it changed the signal quite drastically. So the fact that there's a lot of DSP going on is going to put off some people who have a more sort of purist view of what a DAC should do, and that it shouldn't be altering things in order to try and make it sound better. It should just be doing what the file is saying. And in some ways I agree. And I wouldn't use this as a reference DAC. I wouldn't use this as something which I want to sound realistic. But it's really, really fun. It's really, really nice to listen to. So it's really about, if you're getting this for listening enjoyment, if you're getting this for something which you don't mind that it's not technically correct. It isn't technically correct, but it sounds great. So I'll leave that part up to you. So the timbre and spatial presentation of this DAC are both really impressive and really enjoyable to listen to, but also just a little bit unusual and quirky at the same time. So that's going to be a personal preference thing. I personally quite like it, but wouldn't use this as a main DAC because of it. I mean, partially just because as a reviewer, I need something which is normal and what I would personally consider to be correct. I love listening to this, but comparing it to other stuff is somewhat pointless just because of the DSP that's going on. The detail retrieval, though, it's not just the macrodynamics that are slammy and impressive. The micro detail, the microdynamics, and just the actual resolution is really, really good. So when you listen to a good classical and orchestral recording, it's wonderfully immersive. And when you put something on that just puts all of this together perfectly, like there's a genre which I guess the best word for it is electro-orchestral, i.e. everything that Red Bull Symphonic does, and it's just perfect for this. So No Tomorrow by Camo and Crooked. Please, Red Bull Symphonic, make more music. It's fantastic, and it sounds so good on this. Seriously, it's just vivid and fast and layered and expansive. It's just doing everything right. I really like the sound of this DAC. It is not a normal sounding DAC, and I couldn't use it as my main one, both because I feel like over time I would want something which is a little bit more convincing sounding. And also just because as a reviewer, I do need something which is, well, yeah, it's not doing all the DSP that this is doing. This is great to listen to, but comparing it to other DACs is a little bit pointless just because you need to be comparing things which are kind of on even footing. And doing DSP inherently makes comparisons somewhat pointless. But it sounds good. If you buy this, you're going to be very happy with it, pretty much regardless of what sort of genres you listen to. And that includes music and genres which is not particularly audiophile-y. Stuff which might even just have very poor production, SoundCloud, Spotify, whatever, because whilst a lot of people will, in some ways, quite rightly say you need to use high-quality music and orchestral or classical stuff to judge a DAC, which, yes, that does show some aspects a lot clearer than other genres, we don't always listen to that. Sometimes you want to just put something from the depths of your library on, which has just awful production and mastering, and you need it to sound good. Because on some very high-end chains, it can become painfully obvious when something has not been produced well, to the point that it's unpleasant to listen to, and that limits what you can select from your library. This DAC doesn't have that problem. So when you play something like Romeo by Jungle, which I like this song a lot, the actual song itself is great, but Jesus, the production is all over the place. It still sounds fine, and I've just got a smile on my face the whole way through.
Never lose, steady climb, city crime infested. 10 years, so divine my blessings. I injected hope into my lungs and spoke up things I want.
The vocals are a bit overly forward in this track, and on some things that can be painful. There are even just outright flaws in this track. This has nothing to do with the DAC, but if I just go to 50 seconds in, that pop was not your speakers, it's not your headphones, that is just in the track. What the hell? Anyway, the point is, this sounds great on this. As does really high quality, well-produced orchestral music, as does just about anything you could pick. Everything sounds good on this. This is a very, very universal, very enjoyable sounding DAC that I think just about anyone is going to be really happy with. The main reason I would say not to get this DAC is if you are the kind of person that is either looking for a sort of studio reference type sound or something which I personally would consider to be as realistic as possible. Something which you listen to just about any instrument or any vocal and it sounds as close to real life as it can. This is a little bit more vivid, a little bit more saturated, a little bit more emphasized than real life, but that makes a lot of music really quite a bit more enjoyable in some ways. So that's a personal preference thing. I personally couldn't use this as my reference DAC because of that. I need something which is more natural, but a lot of people are going to really like that effect. One thing that a lot of people who are looking at this DAC are also going to be considering is, should they get it with the Gaia? The Gaia is Denafrips' flagship DDC, and I did have this here for a fair while as well. The Gaia is brilliant. I really like the Gaia. It's one of the highest performing DDCs I've tested. There are measurements on my site. It's one of the most fully featured. It's got the most I/O. It's got higher sample rate support than most DDCs. It's fantastic. It's a brilliant product. But it doesn't make a difference to the Terminator Plus. Now, the reason for this is that normally, when you connect a DAC to a DDC via either SPDIF or I2S ideally, the clock signal from the DDC feeds the DAC directly. There might be a PLL in the way, but for the most part, the clocks from the DDC are actually controlling when the next sample gets converted. That's not the case on the Terminator Plus. The Terminator Plus buffers all of its digital inputs and then converts them using its own internal clock. And in fact, if you use the clock sync with the Gaia, then the internal clock of the DAC is controlling the Gaia anyway. So basically, when I had the Gaia, even though the Gaia did make a quite substantial improvement to other DACs I've got here, like an X26 Pro, it didn't make a shred of difference to the Terminator Plus. And before someone goes in the comments saying, well, I got a Gaia and it made a massive difference, check that your channels aren't swapped. Because one thing I noticed was that when you connect the Gaia and you set this and the Gaia up exactly as the manual says, the left and right channels are swapped. So something's been mislabeled somewhere. I just swapped them back in Rune. But yeah, check that your channels aren't swapped, because if you're hearing a massive difference, that might be why. So a brief summary there is that yes, the Gaia is a fantastic product, and if you want to buy it, you're not going to get any kind of downgrade in quality, but I don't think it's worth buying specifically for use with the Terminator Plus. Even though, ironically, it is actually a really good DDC with other non-Denafrips products. It's just the fact that Denafrips buffers all digital inputs, and it uses its own internal clock no matter what you're doing, so the jitter performance just does not change. So, what's the conclusion? The conclusion is the Terminator Plus is absolutely fantastic. I've really, really enjoyed my time with this DAC. It's been absolutely brilliant. I'm not keeping it, though. The simple reason being that it's not a entirely normal sounding DAC. It does have a few quirks, and that it both means that I can't compare it fairly to other DACs. I can't use this as a reference point because it's not a reference sort of sound. And it also means that I think after a longer period of time, I would end up wanting something sounding a bit more realistic, a bit more convincing. But it's really, really good. It's absolutely one of the most enjoyable DACs I've tried in recent months, and I highly recommend it. Just about anyone who buys this is going to be very, very happy, regardless of the kind of music you listen to, and I think that this is going to suit most people's tastes. If you'd like to talk to me and other Wiggly Air enthusiasts about music, gear, and anything else in between, then do join my Discord server. Or if you'd like to join the supporters-only Telegram chat and help make more videos like this possible, then consider supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar. Currently, all income from Patreon and Subscribestar is going towards either getting things in for review or paying off the analyzer. A huge thank you to my crazy Summitfy supporters Architect, Chief Big Time, Dan Mellinger, Fake Aussie Accent, G'day Mate, Joe, Ross Kyle, Dizarasta, and my legend tier patrons Gravitas, Chandler Bassett, Chris, CK Yozizawa Zoo, Dwayne Butler, and Jithan the Shiba. And my diamond tier patrons Naivo Tsu, Adam Cardos, Beefy Fish, Chris Johnson, Not Twist, Gizmo1K, King Jung-un, Luxifer, Nick McKay, and Pokey. Thank you guys so much for your support. You make all of this possible.